Good evening, everyone. I'm David Dawson. I'm director of the Wiltshire Museum. It's fantastic to be able to welcome you to this talk tonight, or talk conversation tonight, where we're going to be looking at the links between Avebury and Orkney. Just before we get going, just to apologise that Josh Pollard has been held up in traffic. He had the excitement of a 1-hour traffic queue just outside Winchester. So we're hoping he'll join us by about 8:30, as long as his journey has been smooth. But tonight we're here to celebrate the 35th anniversary of the inscription of the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site by UNESCO. Stonehenge and Avebury was one of the first World Heritage Sites to be inscribed, and there are now many right the way across the world, and including, of course, Orkney, prehistoric Orkney, which is absolutely fabulous. So tonight we're going to be looking at the links between Avebury and Orkney, because everything you see on the media is always about the place that begins with an S, the pile of rocks, whereas Avebury tends to miss out a bit, which is really bonkers, because it's absolutely fascinating site, and it just brings in a whole different perspective. So I'm delighted to be able to welcome Alison Sheridan, who is former curator at the National Museum of Scotland and president of the Prehistoric Society.
Was in 2010 to 2014.
Of course. And just a fantastic speaker, and always has me in fits of laughter every time you give an incredibly serious talk. So it's my pleasure to welcome Alison. And the way we're going to work this is Alison is going to give a presentation, sort of some for about, well, probably 20-25 minutes, and then there's a chance to ask her any immediate questions you have. If you click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, you can type in questions. So very specifically about what she said. Then hopefully Josh will have arrived and he'll do the same. And then we'll start having a discussion about what the links are and sort of what flows from those provocations, I believe is the term one should use. So in that case, over to you, Alison. Really looking forward to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen now and see if I can actually find where the lecture is on my screen. Okay, please forgive me because, oh, I sound like Boris Johnson. Please forgive me. It's showing all sorts of things that it shouldn't be showing. But here we are, divisors. I can see us. Hallelujah. You can see the inner workings of my little computer here.
Nothing too incriminating.
No, nothing at all. Fandabidozy. Can you all see that?
That's perfect.
Oh, that's lovely. So thank you so much, David, for the lovely introduction. And thank you for inviting me to come and chew the fat with Josh. And I certainly hope that he arrives about this most fascinating of subjects. Well, I mean, the title of the event is Avebury Orkney Connections. So I'm going to start off with my bold contention that there was indeed a connection between these two huge henge monuments with stone circles that you see here. And I submit to you, my lud, that the Ring of Brodgar was actually modelled on Avebury by ambitious Orcadians who had been down to Wessex and had been inspired by the magnificence of that monument. Now, I realize that this is going to seem like a big leap of faith to a lot of you. I mean, after all, it's what? Am I seriously suggesting that people traveled 850 kilometers as the crow flies at some point around 2500 or 2400 BC? And what I hope to do over the next 15 or 20 minutes or so is to build my case to support this view that, yes, indeed, that's exactly what they did. And that what we're dealing with here is a question of long distance connections and the dynamics of power. But first, a little bit about these two monuments. While I'm sure that most of you, well, perhaps not the people in America and Australia, but and Canada, will be familiar with Avebury, it may well be that few of you have been to Orkney and seen the Ring of Brodgar. but it's well worth the journey because it's an absolutely magnificent site. And in both cases, these are circles of stone that are surrounded by deep rock-cut ditches, and they will have involved an absolutely massive amount of effort to construct them. There are, admittedly, differences in design and scale. So the Ring of Brodgar is a mere 120 meters in diameter, as opposed to the massive 427 meters, that is a quarter of a mile, of Avebury, a monument so big that they built a medieval village inside it. And while there were only 60 large stones originally in the Ring of Brodgar, there were nearly 100 in the outer stone circle at Avebury. Likewise, there is no bank outside the ditch at the Ring of Brodgar. And at Avebury, as no doubt Josh will tell you if he turns up, I hope he does, there are also additional features inside Avebury. So there are 2 stone circles, there's a cove, and these include some earlier features. So it's quite a complicated site. Nevertheless, the Ring of Brodgar is by far the largest henge and stone circle in Scotland, and it dwarfs its near neighbour, the Stones of Ness in Orkney. Date-wise, Josh's careful work has established that the large stone circle and the ditch at Avebury were created around 2500 BC. The dating of the Ring of Brodgar is far less satisfactory because it relies on optically stimulated luminescence dates that place it around 2400 BC, but which have quite a large plus or minus attached to that. However, folks accept that it definitely postdates the Stones of Ness, which we know for sure to have been built between around 3000 and 2900 BC. And I'm quite happy with the date of around 2400 for the Ring of Brodgar. Within the context of late Neolithic to Chalcolithic Orkney, the Ring of Brodgar totally dominates the landscape. And it represents the final chapter in an amazing story of societal boom and bust that involved long distance travel and extensive networking. If I'm right, and the Ring of Brodgar was indeed an attempt to recreate the majesty of Avebury in Orkney, then this won't have been the first instance of long distance connections between Orkney and Wessex, nor was it the last, as we shall see. In order to place the Ring of Brodgar and the question of Orkney-Wessex connections in context, I want to go back quite a long way to the second half of the 4th millennium BC in Orkney, when the prosperous farmers who had been farming for several generations there seem to have started to indulge in a process of competitive, conspicuous consumption to see who could build bigger and better monuments for the dead. We can see this process of aggrandizement in the construction of a large horned cairn at Point of Cot on the small island of Westray in Orkney, which was significantly larger than the pre-existing simple passage tombs that had been in existence before that. And it was probably also modelled on the massive horned cairns of Caithness on the northern mainland of Scotland, because we know for sure that the people who lived in Orkney were adept at crossing the dangerous Pentland Firth, and they had a lot of contacts with people in Caithness and Sutherland on the northern mainland. And these people in Orkney also built bigger versions of the so-called stalled cairns, which is the other main kind of chamber tomb that we find in Orkney. So at Mid-Howe, they built a monument so big that it's actually currently covered over by an aircraft hangar. And the monument itself is about the length of 2 double-decker buses. And it's not the only huge monument on the tiny island of Rousay. There are several others, as well as smaller stalled cairns. So clearly, an awful lot of effort was going into demonstrating the respect with which the dead were held. And also by doing that, people were showing off how wealthy and prosperous and powerful they were, that they could afford to rally enough people to build a major monument like this. The out-and-out winners in this inflationary spiral of competitive conspicuous consumption were the people who built Mace Howe Passage Tomb and similar monuments, probably around 3100 BC. Now, these passage tombs differ from all of the other preceding chamber tombs in Orkney in several respects. They have long passages and cells which lead off from the chambers, and some, such as Pira Wall on the small island of Westray in the north of Orkney, have passage tomb art, include pecked designs that were never before used on Orcadian chamber tombs. Moreover, Maze Howe was orientated so that the setting sun around midwinter solstice shone along the passage, illuminating the chamber and thereby reawakening the spirits of the dead who were buried inside there. The key thing about Maze Howe type passage tombs is that they were deliberately emulating the amazing passage tomb of the Boyne Valley in the east of Ireland, and in particular Newgrange, with its cruciform chamber so similar to that of Maze Howe, as you can see here. And at Newgrange, it also had spiral and other high relief designs, and it too was orientated on the midwinter solstice sun. At Newgrange, it was the rising sun that shone through a roof box along the passage and into the chamber, whereas at Maze Howe, it was the setting sun. And it may well be that this was because the specific topography in the area around Maze Howe meant that it wasn't possible to design a monument that would, so that the sun would do its thing as it rose around midwinter solstice. But I think the fact that both of these are aligned on the same celestial phenomenon is very, very significant indeed. And you can see here as well that how similar the design on Pira Wall quarry stone is to the design here on one of the curbstones in front of the entrance at Newgrange. The only difference being a very slight difference in detail about how the interlinked spirals were linked. So in Orkney, they took this idea and they gave it a particular Orcadian twist, as it were, to produce this so-called horned spiral here. But I think the inspiration is very, very clear. It seems here that Newgrange, Knowth and Dowth, which were constructed around 3200 BC, must have been wonders of the ancient world, and they must have drawn people from far and wide to marvel at them and to join in the midwinter celebrations. And it seems to us that the elite of Orkney indulged in what the anthropologist Mary Helms has referred to as cosmological acquisition in travelling down by sea to the Boyne Valley. In other words, they undertook long distance, difficult journeys by boat, acquiring esoteric knowledge and bringing back grand design ideas, and also perhaps actually bringing back some exotic objects such as the polished stone balls, these smooth stone balls that were in use in Irish passage tombs, as you can see from this example here that was found at Baccascale in Orkney. They would then have really, really impressed their neighbours back home in Orkney, and they would have enhanced their standing in Orcadian society by building Boyne-style passage tombs and organising amazing midwinter celebratory rituals. You might well ask how the people in Orkney knew about Newgrange, Knowth and Dowth in the first place. And the answer to this is that there had been a pre-existing network of contacts, and there had been toing and froing along the Atlantic facade for several generations already, so from at least as early as 3600 BC. We can see this in the sharing of a specific kind of very distinctive pot, the so-called Unston bowl, both in the Western Isles in the Outer Hebrides, as you can see here, an example that was found at Loch Arnish in the Isle of Lewis, and then you can see bowls from the eponymous chamber tomb at Unston in Orkney. And it does seem as though people were sailing, it was about a 5-day sail from Orkney to the island of Lewis in order to have feasts with these people, because there's the amazing work that's being done by Duncan Garrow and Fraser Sturt on the Neolithic crannogs of the island of Lewis right now. And they have decided that these artificial islets were probably used as places where people came from far and wide to feast. And so you get Orcadian visitors bringing the idea of an Orcadian style of pot and feasting with their long distance neighbours. We also know in turn that the people who lived in the Outer Hebrides were in contact with people in Ireland. and had been for several generations. And the evidence for this includes this magnificent axe that was found in peat at Shulishada on the island of Lewis, and we've radiocarbon dated the haft to around 3,300 to 3,000 BC. And the axe head itself is made of porcelainite, which is a distinctive kind of rock that you only get outcropping at Tivbulia in County Antrim, and also on the island of Rathlin off the north coast, also in County Antrim. And also there are these sherds of Hebridean Neolithic pottery that have been found on the coast of Northern Ireland at Port Stewart. So we can imagine this very active network of contacts, so that people in Ireland would be able to tell their counterparts in the Outer Hebrides about the wonders of the Boyne Valley. And in turn, this news would travel fast and far as the people in Orkney, who were very interested indeed in it. So we also know that people from Orkney were making absolutely incredible long distance journeys to the continent. And here, in fact, I should say that the people who had built the tombs in the Boyne Valley were no slouches themselves when it came to cosmological acquisition, because there are elements of the design and the artifacts that are found in Newgrange and Knowth that tell us that the people who built those tombs had travelled to Brittany and had adopted the style of passage tomb art that they found there. They had also travelled as far as Iberia, acquiring little objects from northwest Spain and also from Portugal that have ended up in the tomb at Knowth and Newgrange. So, but we know that the people in Orkney, the elite, these rich cowboys, must have got in a boat and they must have sailed themselves as far as the continent, probably Brittany or Iberia. And we know this from this amazing tiny little critter here, the Orkney vole, that has a very, very interesting genetic history. And so the Orkney vole is unlike any other vole that is found in Britain or Ireland. And the geneticists have said that it can only have arrived in Orkney by boat in a single journey from somewhere on the continent. Enough of these have been radiocarbon dated for us to know that they had arrived in Orkney as early as 3,200 BC. And we also know, thanks to work by an amazing guy called André Romagnoc, that at Skara Brae, they were catching and cooking these Orkney voles because they'd make a tasty little snack. And we know that because the extremities, so the mandibles and the ends of their little legs, have been charred. It's as though you catch your vole, you stick a skewer through it, and you heat it up. And we also know, again, from amazing work by André Romagnoc and colleagues, from this CT scan of a coprolite, a dog coprolite, and that's a turd to you and me, that the dogs at Skara Brae were also eating Orkney voles. But why they should have voles on these boats? Well, I think they probably weren't, they didn't sort of climb on themselves, so they weren't stowaways. I do think that rather as the Romans are known to have taken dormice on their long sea journeys, so the people of Orkney will have taken these voles because they know that voles breed like rabbits, so they will be a self-replenishing, tasty source of food for the very long sea journey between the continent and back to Orkney. So, vol au vent, rodent Josh, anybody? Oh, you may laugh. I can't see you and I can't hear you, so you're probably all going, oh my God. Anyway, where were we? So, yes, long and short of it is that people were going to the Boyne Valley from far and wide, not just from Orkney. We know that they were going across from Wales as well, because you see various Irish passage tombs that are built in the Irish style, such as this one at Barclodiad y Gowres in Anglesey, and also at Calderstones in Liverpool. That's another example of an Irish passage tomb with Irish passage tomb art. So, what then was happening in Orkney? You have this scenario of these very powerful people, the elite of Orkney. They would have been prosperous farmers, cowboys is a sort of derogatory term for them, but actually they will have got rich because of the very rich pasture land in Orkney. We know that they were cultivating cereals. They started off with wheat and barley, and then they tended to specialize in barley. And they had cattle, sheep and pigs. And by the time of the Middle to Late Neolithic, they were probably also eating marine resources as well. But what these people did, the ones who built Maes Howe, they also created a brand new social order for themselves, featuring themselves on top. So they came up with a totally new kind of monument, which was the stone circle surrounded by a ditch, which we call a henge. So here you have the stones of Ness, which we know to have been built between 3000 and 2900 BC. These guys also invented a brand new style of pottery, which we call grooved ware pottery. And this differed from what went before because it was flat-based, and it's decorated with designs that borrow from Irish passage tomb art. So you get the use of the lozenge here, or nested lozenges, which is very, very distinctive, and you can trace it right back to Irish passage tomb art. Grooved ware pottery owes nothing to the kind of pottery that was used by the users of passage tombs in Ireland. That was different kind of pottery. So it's something which was invented in Orkney. These people also wore very, very ostentatious jewelry. And they will have built settlements such as the very famous site of Skara Brae. And the thing is that this jewelry, it was made of all sorts of bone, cattle bone, whale bone, pendants of sperm whale ivory. And the very large pins that were used to fasten their clothes are probably based on the pins that they saw in Ireland, but they're bigger, better, fancier versions. And the other really distinctive thing about the folks in Neolithic Orkney is that they were using a whole variety of odd-shaped stone objects. So you get carved stone balls, you get the thing that looks rather like the thing that you throw and goes off, you know, this kind of bomb that you throw. And these things, we know that they could have been used as weapons. Grenade, that's the word I was using, sorry, but trying to we know that these things were used as weapons because there's a series of skulls from Orkney that actually have blunt force trauma that matches either a carved stone ball or a mace head. So these were weapons, but they were also very much weapons of social exclusion. So they would only have been the property of the elite. And if you imagine Skara Brae with its wonderful little stone dresses, they may well have laid out their jewelry and these stone weapons for people to see and admire. And they're quite variable in shape, and it may well be that they were personalized so that the grenade, everyone would know that that's mine because it's that distinctive shape, whereas the three-pronged thing, that would be David Dawson's weapon of choice. Okay. Also, cattle are very much cattle are the key to the prosperity of these farmers. And we know from genetic work of the cattle that have been found in Orkney, particularly at the links of Notland, that they went in for interbreeding domesticated cattle with wild aurochsen on the northern mainland of Scotland. And then they brought the calves back to Orkney. And this was a deliberate strategy to increase the size of the cattle so that you would get much more meat per animal. And we know from analysis of the pottery that they were also already, and had been for several generations, using cattle for dairy products as well. So, you know, Orkney was a pretty good place for farming, and it was very easy to build up a surplus of food, which meant that you could then afford to pay people in food, or you could have these very generous feasts that you would invite people to. Also know, I hope that a lot of you will have by now heard of the amazing site at Ness of Brodgar, which is not far away from the stones of Ness, and it's a stone's throw away from Maes Howe. It's on an isthmus between two lochs, and it's been excavated by Nick Card, and it's the most fantastic site you could ever imagine, where over time they were building bigger and bigger house-like structures, including the ones that you can see here with the piers that go in. We know that they had stone slabbed roofs, and these buildings are so large that you could imagine that if people were coming as pilgrims to the heart of Neolithic Neolithic Orkney, then the elite could have accommodated and entertained all of these pilgrims in these very large structures here. And Nessa Brogar was enclosed or bounded by walls to the north and the south. And it also is associated with a very large midden, where there's plenty of cattle bones there. So clearly people were, living high on the hog and entertaining people in the Ness of Brodgar. So in a way, the heart of Neolithic Orkney was supplanting the Boyne Valley as becoming the must-go-to place for seeing the wondrous monuments that were built there and participating in the feasts, particularly the midwinter solstice ceremonies at Orkney. And we can be sure that people were doing that because they were coming from far and wide. Because, for example, we can track the rapid and widespread adoption of both grooved ware and the practice of building stone circles and indeed timber circles. There may well have been timber circles in Orkney as well. So, for example, at Callanish on the island of Lewis, the first stage in this complex monument was a stone circle that looks very, very similar indeed to the stones of Stenness. And indeed, there is an early grooved ware bowl found just to one side of the stone circle at Callanish. And that site, it dates to around 2900 BC. And you can follow it right along the western facade. So if you look at Macri Moor or Temple Wood in Kilmartin Glen, you can see there, it's similar, and in a couple of these sites, you have timber circles that are then replaced by stone circles. And I could tell the same story right the way down the eastern side of Britain as well. And it wasn't just stone circles and pottery that reflect people's adoption of ideas from Orkney. So here at Achnabrec, at the southern end of Kilmartin Glen in the west of Scotland, you can see an Orcadian horned spiral that has been pecked into the living rock. And work by Aaron Watson has shown that this predates the cup marks and cup and ring marked Atlantic rock art that was then added to this particular site here. And Aaron has also noted that this particular motif is most clearly seen at midwinter solstice sunset. So people were adopting midwinter ceremonies from Orkney, and they were sort of reinventing them and adopting and using them in their own way, far and wide. And we can see this in the Boyne Valley itself, where at Knowth, at one of the smaller tombs, there is this early grooved ware pot, which you could have lost in Orkney. And it was associated with cremated bones that have been radiocarbon dated. You can see the date here. There was also a little miniature mace head pendant, which is a miniature of the kind of mace heads that were in use at Ness of Brodgar and elsewhere in Orkney. But also, amazingly, at Knowth, the eastern tomb, at the top left of this picture, there was an incredibly beautiful flint mace head that, as you can see, has got an Orcadian style horned spiral design on it. So even though you don't get flint of this quality occurring in Orkney, nevertheless, we know very well that people were making mace heads at Ness of Brodgar. And it may be that this particular one was finished off at Ness of Brodgar. Also from Knowth, in the western tomb, there is a pestle-shaped mace head that you can see here. And this is a very similar shape and size to a pestle-shaped mace head made of Lewisian gneiss that was found at Ness of Brodgar. And interestingly, in both cases, these had been deliberately broken. And that was very much one of the rituals that we see in late Neolithic Orkney. So it's a bit like the potlatch ceremonies of the Northwest Coast native Americans, where they would take precious items and they would deliberately destroy them in ceremonies, partly to show off their wealth and their power. And also, of course, in Irish passage tombs, you get miniature versions of pendants. For me, the most fun example of this connection and this sort of this southward spread of influence from Orkney to the Boyne Valley comes from a couple of tiny little beads that were found in Knowth. And we worked out that these are actually miniatures of 6-knobbed carved stone balls, which are a Scottish artifact par excellence. And you get 6-knobbed carved stone balls turning up at Ness of Brodgar and at Scarabray in Orkney. So where does Wessex fit into all of this? We've said that there was a very rapid and widespread southward spread of the use of grooved ware pottery. You can see this here, for example, in Balfarg Riding School and Balfarg Timber Circle in Fife in the east of Scotland. You can see it in Cumbria in northwest England. You can see it in Anglesey in northwest Wales. We've already seen it in Nauf. And in fact, you can go as far southwest as County Cork, where there is early grooved ware that's echoing Orcadian grooved ware. Also, Bulford, this fantastic site in Wiltshire. It was the excavation of a modern army residential camp. Wessex Archaeology have excavated an assemblage within pits of the kind of grooved ware that you could lose at somewhere like Barnhouse in Orkney. And I'm very grateful to Elena Brooke of Wessex Archaeology for allowing me to show this slide here of this pottery. I mean, it is uncannily like the pottery that you find in Orkney. And this dates to around 3000 BC. And very usefully, the work by David Roberts and Pete Marshall in rounding up all of the radiocarbon dates for grooved ware in Wessex, or in Wiltshire particularly, has shown that grooved ware started to be used there as early as 3000 BC. So what we seem to have is a scenario where people went from Wessex up as far as Orkney, and they adopted very specific Orcadian style grooved ware. We know that these contacts continued because here at Barrow Hills at Radley in Oxfordshire, you get the use of an Orcadian style of grooved ware that's not the very earliest style. So this style was in use probably around 2900 BC. So people start going up there, they continue having close links here. And we should remind ourselves that the grooved ware pottery used to be called Rinio-Clacton pottery, after the links that Gordon Childs spotted between the pottery from Rinio in Orkney and Clacton in Essex. So the links between this grooved ware pottery in Orkney and elsewhere in Britain has been recognised for a long time. Other evidence that we have for connections. So into the S-word place, Stonehenge, there is this wonderful, very small ovoid mace head made of Lewisian gneiss, which originated in the Isle of Lewis, which was associated with the cremated remains that date to around 3000 BC. Okay, and we also have this tiny little pottery object, and it's sort of hollow on the top and the bottom, and it was found in Aubrey Hole 29 at Stonehenge, and so it's likely again to date to about 3000 or 2900 BC. And what I think it is, but I can't prove it, it probably was a chafing dish, which would have been a container for glowing embers that would have been used to light a funerary pyre, to get the pyre going. And the decoration on this has been paralleled with some of the decoration that you find on Orcadian grooved ware. So what happened then? Well, what happened then in Wessex is history, haha, as they say. But then you also get little hints later on that there were connections again with Orkney. So Mike Parker Pearson has argued on the basis of his excavations at Durrington Walls that the pre-henge houses that you have there echo the design of the houses at Skara Brae in their sort of sub-square design here with a central hearth. He thought that there could be remains of a timber dresser here, rather like the stone dresser that you see in one of these houses from Skara Brae. And okay, you could niggle with the details, but I think that's a very interesting suggestion. It's also been argued that the so-called large ceremonial house inside Durrington Walls at the time when the henge was built, if you look at this in plan, it is actually, it looks like a stone circle with 4 very substantial timber posts inside it. And this square encircle arrangement of timbers is something which is found very, very widespread. And Sue Greeny has very recently, in the last Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society, published a fantastic prize-winning article that discusses the distribution of these square encircle structures. You find these square and circle structures at Knowth, outside the main entrance to Knowth in the Boyne Valley. You find them in Wales. You find them in northern Scotland. You don't happen to find them in Orkney. But we do know that there were for sure clear links between Wessex and parts of Scotland sometime around 2800 and 2500 BC. So this pot, for example, that was found in Angus, in the east of Scotland, has the vertical cordons, vertical and horizontal cordons that you get if you look at the pottery from Durrington Walls. And the pottery from Durrington Walls dates to between 2600 and 2500 BC. And it's thought that this specific design is probably a skeuomorph of a wicker basket. And you can see that between the vertical cordons, you get this crisscross scratched design that may represent the kind of willow, basketry. So you get this kind of pottery as far north as Inverness. You don't tend to get it in Orkney. But certainly this tells us that around 2600, 2500 BC, for sure, people were traveling, or ideas were spreading between Wessex and Scotland. Then, meanwhile, what had been happening in Orkney? So one of the last buildings to be built was this huge structure 10 at the Ness of Brodgar, and it was a big communal structure. But actually then, from about 2800 BC, this inflationary spiral of building ever bigger structures burst. And there was some kind of a collapse. So all of these structures then fell into disrepair. And in fact, at structure 10, there is a final act that took place long after the building was decommissioned. And this final act was an incredible feast. And it was a feast of up to 400 cattle. And you're talking there about tons of beef being eaten. And then the bones were laid out in the sort of walkway that goes around the outskirts of building 10. It was an amazing thing. So giant feast, probably dating to around 2350 BC. Then that takes us right back to this whole question of, right, Ring of Brodgar. Was this also built at the time when they had that amazing large feast? Was it the last hurrah for a society that had been through a boom and bust period in Orkney? And was it that we know again that these contacts that go right the length of Britain, people will have been aware of Avebury, and they may well have gone from Orkney down to Avebury. And in a last attempt to prop up a society that was clearly failing, they managed to get people together to build the Ring of Brodgar. And they maybe had that cattle feast to celebrate by the people who built the Ring of Brodgar. I said before that it wasn't the last example of connections with Orkney, between Orkney and Wessex. So sometime probably around 1900 BC, there is this incredible example of a woman who was buried at the Knells of Trotty in Orkney. She was cremated, but beside her and unburnt, there were the remains of an old and worn spacer plate necklace of amber. There were also these funny little prismatic beads of amber and these hook-shaped pieces for which the only parallels can be found in Wessex at Winterbourne Stoke, I think. And then these gold things which covered conical mounts, they echo the very fine linear gold work that was in use by the Wessex elite, such as Bush Barrow, which you can see on display in the museum at Devizes. And again here, this can only, the amber objects can only have got to Orkney by somebody having got in a boat and gone these 850 kilometers down to Wessex. So that's me done, and I'm pleased to see that Josh has already arrived and I hope has taken a couple of breaths. So over back to you, David.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Absolutely amazing. So much for the 15 minutes, but I've been absolutely riveted to that. Some amazing insights, lots of things that I didn't know. if I can just ask if there's anyone who's got a particular question they'd like to ask while Josh is just getting himself ready. I know he was heading for a glass of wine to calm him down after his slightly traumatic journey. If anyone has a quick question or two, something about anything that Alison has just been talking about, otherwise we'll hand over to Josh. So Sally has said, how fertile was the land in Orkney in... Oh, yep, thank you. Someone's reminded me I need to put my microphone back. How fertile was the land in Orkney in Neolithic times?
Yeah, I think it was very fertile and particularly good for grazing. So there, you have lots of open grassland, and we know from the cattle that they were able to sustain very large cattle there. And as I said before, we know that the cattle had been used for dairying as well as for meat. And we do know that they were cultivating cereals as well. And they would have had plentiful manure. They were enriching the sandy soils in Orkney to help boost the production of cereals. So I think it was mainly the cattle that were enabling people to build up a big surplus there, which would then mean that they would be able to have feasts. They'd be able to pay other people, or you could get other people to do things by saying, okay, we'll feed you if you do this for me.
Okay, and one last question from Colin. What evidence do we have for boats at this time, if any?
Okay, we don't have any of the actual kind of curragh type boats which would have been used. And as you know, a curragh, which was in use in Ireland until the 20th century, it's a very light a light structure that would have been covered by animal skins and made watertight. And Clive O'Givney actually makes curraghs today, and he sailed them on the open seas, and they're absolutely fine. And in fact, they could have had sails. But the trouble is that because they're such lightweight things, they're not going to survive at all. So we do have log boats from the Neolithic period, but log boats would have been used for inland sailing. So, or at the very best, inshore sailing. You would certainly not try and cross the open sea in a log boat.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. I think now we'll turn to Josh, who I hope is poised, ready. Is he? Yes, he is. He's just joining us on the video. Fantastic.
Yes. Okay. Well, good to see you both anyway.
And I hope your glass of wine is going down, slipping down nicely.
It's gone. Ready.
Excellent. Right. Okay. So the floor is yours. Alison and I will hide ourselves away. So hopefully you're ready to go.
Okay. Right. Let's go. Well, thank you, Alison, for providing. Well, I got the end of a very stimulating talk, and also managing to keep going while I was winding my way back. So I'm going to sort of pick up on the themes of connections, and going to sort of discuss, if you like, some of the kind of material links that might try and take us from Avebury in the south on a journey up to the north, and see whether or not we can find other supporting evidence that can provide links between this part of Wessex and Orkney. First of all, must thank colleagues, because inevitably knowledge that is accrued is accrued through the work of many folk. And a particular thanks to Ros Cleal, since many discussions we've had about material things and connections have fed into this lecture. And while I was stuck in traffic this evening, I remembered another thing, which is a certain side looped pin that maybe Ros could mention after I've finished speaking. So first of all, let's think about time. And within this talk, I'm going to look at events post 3400 BC. So I'm going to ignore the early part of the Neolithic, and if you like, sort of focus on two periods of time, which kind of the first of which overlaps, if you like, with one of the sort of heyday of Neolithic Orkney, the later phases, for example, of the Nessa Brodgar. And that's, if you like, the developed Middle Neolithic in a southern British sense, a point in time when we have peterer-ware pottery. We have a range of Neolithic types, including things like chisel arrowheads and so forth. And in terms of what's going on in the Avebury landscape, this might be a period of time running from, as I say, about 3200, 2900 BC, where perhaps the first components of the Avebury monument were constructed. Features like the cove and maybe some of the internal settings within the southern inner circle, and possibly even the first phase of the Avebury earthwork. We also know at the time that part of the outer ditch at Windmill Hill was recut. And we know that this was generally quite a busy time within the Avebury landscape, because we have quite well-defined settlement evidence coming from various locations, represented by scatters of worked flint and peterer-ware, and a sense that there are sort of good numbers of people around, even after the kind of heyday of early Neolithic and the main phase of activity at Windmill Hill and many of the region's long barrows. And then we're going to skip a few centuries, and we're going to look at events during the final Neolithic, during the last stages of the late Neolithic. So running from about 2500, 2200 BC. And this is a period of colossal activity within the Avebury landscape, as indeed it is in places like the Stonehenge landscape, Dorchester in Dorset, most probably also true for Knowlton, we know for Marden, and I would guess also Stanton Drew as well. So within the wider region, we have massive periodic aggregations of people. We have the construction of some of the largest monuments that we've ever seen. In the Avebury case, with the main earthwork, with the outer stone circle, followed by the avenues, monuments like the Sanctuary, the West Kennet Palisades, and Silbury Hill, which is if you like, the in labour terms at least, the biggest of the lot. Although curiously, during this period of time, although we know large numbers of people would have been present within the landscape on occasions, the settlement record is sometimes a bit more difficult to pin down, albeit there's a possibility that actually the main focus is actually on the southern slopes of Windmill Hill. And this is also a point in time where we see new connections forged through the appearance of the earliest beaker communities, both within this landscape and elsewhere. And certainly available evidence would suggest that perhaps there's a period of 2, maybe 3 centuries or so where we have coexistence of groups who are culturally late Neolithic, Grooved Ware using communities, and we have early beaker, initially sort of migrant communities within the landscape who are living in a kind of coexistent fashion. Now, what evidence do we have for connections? There's a range of sources we can draw upon. We can look at isotopic evidence for both animals and humans. So basically looking at bone geochemistry to work out where people or animals were raised versus the locations where their remains end up. We have materials, we have substances, if you like, which are non-local, which can bespeak of connections. We have regionally distinctive objects as well, and Alison has touched upon that in her talk in good detail. As well, again, as architecture, the architecture of monuments, the architecture of domestic spaces, and practices, things like funerary traditions and so forth. So we're back with the Avebury Orkney Challenge, part 2, and the question is, how far can we get? And certainly what I want to show is that there is good evidence of long distance connections. The best perhaps coming from some regions slightly further south, but also with intriguing further evidence of links up to the far north. And we also want to think as well about the nature of those connections, whether it's just simply, as is often posited, kind of down the line material exchange, or whether in fact there is direct human movement, which seems sort of increasingly to be the case. Whether or not we may be looking at situations where there are connections through kinship and through intermarriage and through a sense of descent as well, which is linking what seem to us to be quite far-flung places. So we can begin first of all with the Middle Neolithic, a period of time where certainly in southern Britain, we know from the economic evidence that we've got a move away from mixed agriculture to most likely pastoralism, and with it probably increased residential mobility. And as I mentioned, in the context of the Avebury landscape, there seems to be one region where we seem to have a very well sustained human presence throughout the Middle Neolithic, and particularly during its second half from about 3200 BC. And we're looking at various objects, particularly lithic objects. We can see some sense of the potential long distance connections that existed. We have artifact types, for example, which are clearly non-local. Perhaps the best example being the wonderful edged polished blade knife from the Millbarrow chambered tomb just in the north of the region, which is a type that Terry Manby has shown is most commonly found and probably largely produced within areas such as Eastern Yorkshire and also the Lincolnshire Wolds, the kind of North Lincolnshire Wolds. And it's quite likely that the Millbarrow knife represents an artifact which has travelled down from parts of Eastern England. We also have in a kind of more routine context within, for example, the West Kennet Avenue occupation site, a very dense cluster of material that relates to repeated and sustained occupation over a period of time. Quite a remarkable range of flint, and this is something that Ben Chan's been looking at. And you might imagine that for a flint-rich landscape like Avebury, that all the material that was being utilised would be local. But alongside local material, there is a very good range, good representation of stuff which is clearly non-local, some of which may have come from further south in Salisbury Plain. But there are other types of flint as well, which again provide connections that take us off to the east and the north. We have pieces of what looks to be Wolds flint. We also have pieces of material like bullhead flint as well, which is likely derived from a location further east along the Thames Valley, from the Reading beds, and which incidentally, there appear to be examples from the Ness of Brodgar in Orkney, a material that might be travelling really quite far and wide. And actually these bits of distinctive non-local flint don't necessarily represent objects which have been exchanged as prestige items like the Millbarrow knife might have been. What we're finding at the West Kennet Avenue occupation site are things like utilised flakes, scrapers, fairly sort of expedient knives, the kinds of things that must surely have travelled as personal possessions, and if you like, surely give an indication of the movement of individual people and communities rather than forms of kind of down the line exchange. It's worth pointing out as well that if we're thinking about the range of lithic sources at the West Kennet site, we can find a very good parallel actually off to the west and in the Welsh borders in Powys at the site of Upper Ninepence, investigated by Alex Gibson, where we get a very similar range both of lithic types and also of lithic forms. So perhaps we can begin to sort of pick up networks extending from the north, extending from the east, and which also take us over to the west and to the Welsh borders. The other interesting features as well, there is an early individual burial from the first phase of the West Overton G19 round barrow, excavated by Jill Swanton and John Evans, which has a Middle Neolithic radiocarbon date, and which in terms of its format and its kind of ring-ditch mound format links through to traditions that we find more commonly in areas like the Thames Valley and of course up in regions like East Yorkshire. And want to keep sort of mentioning those Yorkshire connections and those East Coast connections in various ways, and kind of wonder in very much in sort of speculative fashion whether or not perhaps those early elements of the Avebury monuments, particularly the cove stones, where we have an optically stimulated luminescence date that centers on round about 3200 BC, whether or not these might be linked to broader sort of big stone monuments, including the Rudstone monolith, set as it is within the confluence of four cursus monuments within a region where we have again good sustained middle Neolithic presence. But actually, it's sorry, I'm just looking around because the cat is trying to crawl up the chimney, which can only go wrong. I think it's coming back down again. If you hear a crash in the background, it's down to the cat. Okay. Another interesting context to consider, and one which is kind of going on to focus a little bit, are the secondary deposits in the West Kennet Long Barrow, excavated by Piggott and Atkinson back in the 1950s. And along with a range of Peter wares and early Clacton style grooved ware, which of course we can parallel in context to the east, and as Alison notes, in context up to the north as well, we have a very unusual range of artifacts made of bone and made of shell and made of non-local stone, which are pretty much kind of unparalleled in terms of the richness of the assemblage and the character of the assemblage, but which do in some ways sort of mimic some of the kind of rich and complex deposits we find, for example, within passage grave contexts in the Boyne Valley and of course up in Orkney. And there's some unusual things in here. We have, for example, 3 perforated cattle phalanges, which you can see up in the top right of the slide there, as well as beads made out of materials like jet in one instance and things like shale and lignite. And Piggott was quite perceptive at the time of publication of West Kennet. He noted that amongst the parallels for the perforated phalanges, of which there were very, very few, there was one example from early context at Jarlshof, not particularly well dated, but one from the chamber tomb of Cloch na Husig, if I probably mangled the Gaelic language there, at Lower Dounreay in Caithness, if you like, just across the waters from Orkney. We're getting very, very close there. And also notes as well other examples from Northern Central European contexts, but difficult to parallel otherwise within the Southern British Neolithic. Beads, although they're simple, are still spectacularly rare within Neolithic contexts in Southern Britain, but are, as I say, much more common in the north and the west. There's one example that appears to be a kind of elongated bead with sort of ring groove ornamentation, which has some similarity with objects from the Boyne Valley. And then we have parallels, if you like, with beads more locally in areas like the Cotswolds, but also taking us up into northern Scotland and, of course, off to places like Skara Brae and so forth. Individually, because their simplicity difficult, of course, to be certain about exact parallels. But as I say, as an assemblage, they really sort of stand out as perhaps representing practices of ornamentation and display, and potentially practice of deposition within funerary contexts that hark to other regions, to other worlds. And of course, one of those beads is of jet and will have come from the northeast coast, again taking us back to East Yorkshire. Now, we have something of a bit of a gap. It's partly filled by some of those secondary deposits in the West Kennet Long Barrow. It's partly filled by late activity up at Windmill Hill. But between probably about 2900, 2500 BC, it becomes quite difficult sometimes to pin down particular sites, particular practices and so forth. We get to 2500 BC, and then of course things go absolutely crazy with this the onset of this very massive program of monument building that potentially is occurring episodically over the space of maybe a century, maybe a century and a half, which also begins to overlap with earlier speakers. Now, it's here where we start to have good isotopic evidence of long distance connections, and particularly the work of people like Richard Madrick, Jane Evans, and others looking at the isotopic signatures of pig and cattle bones from the big complex of palisade enclosures at West Kennet, to the south of the Avebury Henge within the shadow of Windmill Hill. And their evidence that a number of those pigs, in fact, a very large number of the pigs sampled, were raised on geologies that take us off the chalk, and that two at least have very high radiogenic levels, looking at the strontium isotopes, and values that could suggest that they were raised conceivably as far north as Scotland, or over on some patches of older geology off to the northwest and west. But hints here of the scale of movement of livestock, and also the by proxy the scale of movement of people coming into the region in order to participate both in the building of these monuments, but also participating in periodic aggregation and feasting. This is a time of extreme long distance connection, and it's simply the scale of the monuments which have been built at the time, and the kind of labour demands that would have led to situations where people were drawing upon alliances, drawing upon obligations as well as enticing people through fame and feast to take part in building these big constructions. We've got interesting monumental analogies as well. Alex Gibson recently pointing out the potential connections, if you like, between events at Duggleby Howe, again East Yorkshire, going back to the kind of Bridlington, wider Bridlington region. The great mound, which starts off in the end of the early Neolithic as a barrow with an incredible sequence of burials running through into the middle and early part of the late Neolithic, and a mound which was seemingly monumentalized probably round about the same time as Silbury Hill was constructed, and also the great mounds within Marden, at Marlborough, and so forth, and surely showing direct evidence of knowledge of the construction of these big monuments, but potentially also reflecting the participation of the same communities in the construction of these structures. And the massive henge-like enclosure around Duggleby also seems to fall within this horizon, the sort of 2500, 2400 BC horizon. So again, we're getting those connections back to East Yorkshire, and we're also getting again those connections which are taking us back to regions like the Welsh borders, and the recognition of the striking similarity, for example, between the Hindwell and Walton Palisade complex and the two main enclosures at West Kennet. A similarity not only in terms of the form of the two monuments, which even extends to things like the sort of southwestern flattening of the bigger single circuit oval enclosures, but also the connections through to water, to river systems, and to springs as well. And again, hinting really quite strongly at the likelihood that we've got direct participation by the same communities within the building of these monuments. And actually, the West Kennet Palisades provide a wonderful context for thinking about long distance links during the final Neolithic. Just to say here, what I'm doing is I recognise that there's been a program of dating of the Palisades undertaken by Alex Bayliss and colleagues. That was published 4 years ago. Dates on charcoal suggesting the Palisades belong to the end of the 4th millennium BC. Actually, through critical review of the dated bone samples from the Palisades, it's clear that there are good bone and antler samples which in fact show that the Palisades were constructed most likely in the 24th or 23rd sorry, 25th, 24th centuries BC, rather than during the Middle Neolithic. The charcoal likely representing kind of residual material. But basically, the palisades seem to have a sense of diverse participation and presence of diverse long distance networks at their very heart. We have, for example, Phil Harding's favourite flint core, found when Wessex Archaeology undertook surface collection across part of the Palisade complex about 15 years ago or so, prior to arable reversion. And lurking in the hedge was this very substantial, albeit perhaps a slightly incomplete core, which is a massive great lump of flint, far bigger than anything you'd ever find in the Avebury landscape, and which Phil and John Lord have shown convincingly belongs to a class of giant late Neolithic flint cores, which have the centre of their distribution within the Breckland region of Norfolk, and many of them are likely to derive from Grimes graves or similar flint deposits. Seems like a bit of a case of coals coming to Newcastle, but surely here again, perhaps speaking of direct human movement from East Anglia through to the West Kennet complex. And from excavations we undertook a couple of years ago, we did actually find 2 flakes from what are probably similar, likely sort of Grimes graves cores from the main part of the Palisades. So this one may not have been unique. We also have from Alistair Whittle's excavations back in the late 80s, early 90s, 2 exceptionally fine ripple flaked oblique arrowheads, a distinctive late Neolithic form. We do, of course, get ripple flaked oblique arrowheads within Wessex contexts, places like Durrington Walls and famously Marden as well. But the West Kennet ones are a bit different. They're morphologically slightly different in terms of being much broader. They're also on a different material as well. They're on a pale, creamy, slightly speckled flint, which again is clearly non-local and which is best paralleled from areas like the Wolds. So the cat is just, sorry about that. And actually, if you want to find direct morphological parallels, again, you've got to look for that sort of Bridlington region of East Yorkshire. Now, when considering those arrowheads, and Roz and I were chatting about the finds from Alistair's excavations undertaken at the West Kennet Palisades, one of the things that's often seemed quite perplexing was the nature of the grooved ware that has been recovered from the site, which, although it falls within the Durrington Walls tradition, is rather idiosyncratic and rather peculiar in many ways, with features such as lugs with sometimes quite profuse use of impressed twisted cord and rather sort of short tub-shaped vessel forms as well, which wouldn't fit at all well in places like Durrington. And actually, it was whilst looking for parallels for the ripple flaked oblique arrowheads that we noticed that there were direct parallels for the West Kennet grooved ware from Rudston in East Yorkshire, forms of vessels which are literally identical and interchangeable with the pots from West Kennet. Now, the West Kennet pots are likely locally made, but the way that they've been made suggests that they're produced by people who have familiarity with the same potting tradition that produced the Rudston vessels. And again, hinting that likely we're looking at a kind of shared ceramic production tradition, which indicates the participation of people who are spending at least part of their time in East Yorkshire, part of their time in the Avebury region. We've done a little bit more work at West Kennet at the Palisades in 2019 and this summer, and quite a bit of that work has focused on an outline element of the Palisades, so-called Structure 5, which wasn't known of at the time of Alistair Whittle's excavations, which we're quite intrigued by, especially because of the funny pit-like anomalies that were present within the centre of it. And although our work has been fairly small scale, it has produced a number of surprises. Perhaps the biggest one is the occurrence in a range of post holes, but also reused in a beaker grave of this very odd-looking stone, which is quite friable in its present condition, but is present in quantity, particularly in the tops of the post holes, and which has been identified through work by Robics and Richard Bevans as having a closest match to a material called granodiorite, and especially a match to outcrops at a place called Cunyon Crags, which is in the Cheviot Hills of Northumberland, not far from the Millfield Basin, an area where we know of a good number of late Neolithic henge monuments. The distance between Avebury and Cunyon Crags is about 480 kilometres, 300 miles. It's a question of how it got to West Kennet. Now, we found about 30 kilos of the stuff so far. It's survived where it's worked its way into the tops of post holes. It hasn't survived where it's been on the surface. It's quite friable stuff. We've sampled a tiny part of structure 5, and if its distribution is in any way uniform across that site, or even across a good part of that site, we must be looking at many hundreds of kilos of this rock. It could be that it represents a glacial boulder, but as Rob points out, the nearest source would still be off to the east, most likely East Anglia. But given the scale of the rock, again, there is a good possibility, a good likelihood that it represents direct import from Cheviot, which represents a very remarkable instance of long distance movement. And it could be that it's actually coming down as perhaps one or more small blocks which are being used as standing stones, as megaliths. And here you can just see some of those blocks of granodiorite kicking around in the tops of post holes and post hole recuts, and also at the bottom there in a ringing a beaker grave cut into the tops of one of the post holes. Here's what we found in the centre of structure 5, a complex mass or mess of features, some of which are post holes, some of which are very giant post holes. The one that we managed at the bottom was 3 meters deep. A later phase of very intense pit digging, and also the occurrence of at least one beaker grave dug into the top of the posts. Now, even from the relatively limited sample we've got, and also so then plotting this against the aerial photographic evidence and geophysical evidence, it's clear that this is not a circular structure. We imagined it might be another big multiple timber circle of the kind that we find elsewhere in Wessex, places like the Southern Circle, the Donington Walls, Woodhenge, and so forth. But in fact, it's quite clear that the plan is one that is made up of rectilinear or conjoined square arrangements of large posts, some of those posts being replaced in quite short order. And it looks as though what we have is picked up is either the northwestern corner of a very substantial long rectilinear structure, perhaps in the order of about sort of 20-25 meters long, or conceivably one of a series of structures, some of which clearly have a rectilinear form. Now, difficult to parallel, and certainly difficult to parallel within the Wessex area. It may be that there's analogy with some of the square encircle post structures, but these are clearly not those sorts of structures, because they lack those kind of outer rings of posts. But we might, for example, just trying to think of the assertion of Orkney connections, think of other monumental rectilinear style structures that might exist within the Neolithic world, albeit probably earlier. We don't yet have dates for the structure 5 structure. It could surprise us. It could go early. It could go close to 2500 BC. But just in the spirit of the evening, in the spirit of connections, it's quite entertaining just to sort of overlay those post patterns onto one of those great piered buildings, structure 8 at the Ness of Brodgar, and just sort of contemplate how perhaps as a timber structure it has a certain kind of resonance with some of those buildings, and even a dimensional resonance in terms of the spacing of the post settings. So who knows, here another architectural connection with Orkney, and we await radiocarbon dates with great interest. So what have we got? Well, we've got a range of long distance connections, and connections which can certainly take us off to the east, off to East Anglia, up to the northeast, up to East Yorkshire, particularly the Bridlington region, another great hotspots, if you like, of Neolithic, Middle Neolithic, Late Neolithic Britain. We have connections that take us up to Northumberland with the granodiorite. We have connections that potentially take us up to parts of Scotland with the isotopic evidence from the pig remains from West Kennet. And we have other material forms that take us up to Caithness, up to Orkney, over to Ireland. And if you like, just reiterating, as Alison has pointed out, that remarkable kind of flow of ideas, of materials, and surely also people across the length and breadth of the British Isles during this period. Now, this covers the best part of 800 years, but there's a question of whether or not this is actually sustained, or whether it might be episodic, whether there might be points where connections kind of come and go, or kind of reinserted at scale at various points in time. What's interesting is the AP evidence suggests rather different networks to those that we find at Stonehenge. There are architectural differences, particularly with late Neolithic monuments. There are material differences in terms of the grooved ware and potentially lithics as well. And it suggests that these complexes are perhaps pulling upon different long distance links to diverse communities. Stonehenge certainly looking off to the west, West Wales, the Irish Sea, and as Alison points out, up to the far north and to Orkney. And again, it makes us think about the nature of those connections. Given the way they're sustained, it's very tempting to see these as being ones which are linked and held together by kinship, held together by intermarriage, held together by sustained movement of people, as well as things between these regions. And also, they illustrate another very important point, is that when we think about wider distance links, it's not necessarily slowly trickling out from a region. It's not as though those connections exist to a greater intensity within the immediate environs and then sort of lessen in their degree as we move outwards. If anything, those connections leapfrog across from region to region, moving over spaces and areas where there doesn't otherwise seem to be much in the way of engagement. So there's something here about that sense of distance, maybe about keeping your relatives at distance, that is being played out. Right, I've talked for too long. I shall stop.
Fabulous, Josh. So if you can stop sharing.
Stop sharing, yeah.
Let's go from there. Absolutely amazing.
Oh, no.
Hit the right button.
How do I stop share?
Yeah,
stop share. It's the red button that's marked stop share, isn't it? That's the one.
That would be the rather obvious one. So I think what I'll just do is ask Alison if you could just give a quick reaction to what Josh has said, and then we just start pitching in.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating stuff. I love all your details. I love the lithic connections. I would say that the isotopic claims for cattle and pigs coming from Orkney is highly contested. And yeah, it's kind of a sensitive thing. We don't really want to go there, but I mean, personally, I don't believe that they came from that far, but I am willing to, they certainly came from a long distance somewhere else.
Yes, that's right. There's as you say, there's a bit of debate going on, isn't there? And you can follow it within the the Archaeological Journal, and there is a rejoinder, if you like, to a critique of those claims of long distance movement, which has just been published.
Neither of you really talked about the sort of the standard trade in Neolithic stone axes, which I think is also quite interesting. And I'm just reminded something that Alison talked about earlier was we've got one stone axe from never know how to pronounce it, Trabula in Northern Ireland, from down in Wiltshire. So there are those links which sort of are coming through as well. But
yes,
those sort of Langdale axes, for example, turn up all over the place.
Yes, but those would mostly be earlier on in the fourth millennium. But actually, what we could talk about is mace heads, and particularly cushion mace heads, which are a very distinctive kind of mace head. And it's fantastic to see Nick Card is with us because he's excavated quite a few of these at Ness of Brodgar. And if you look at the overall distribution of those, you get a lot of them in the Thames Valley. And likewise for late Neolithic, you're talking about jet. You have jet sliders dating to around 3,200-ish. So, I mean, it's a very rich seam. And I think the areas between Orkney and Wessex are well worth closer examination.
You've mentioned Nick. He's I've been texting him, if you like, in between times. He's very happy to come on, and he said he's got a few thoughts to add as well. So I'll just promote him and sort of switch on his audio and video so that he can join us. So he should be here in a moment. The magic of teleportation or something like that. You should be.
We just sort of pick up on a point Alison made. I mean, in relation to stone axes, yes. I mean, clearly we have very well established patterns of long distance movement, but I mean, certainly the evidence from Langdale is suggesting that the production there is pretty much gone by about 3,400, isn't it? And that's probably true as well for places like Graigueluid and those other centres of production. So there's something that is pretty dramatic that happens round about that point in time, which actually breaks up those earlier networks.
Second time lucky. So here's Nick. Hello.
Hello.
Good evening, Alison. Evening, Josh.
Hello.
Thoroughly enjoyed your talks. Very thought-provoking as ever. And I just thought, considering I'm here, maybe add in a few little extras about things which I think definitely support the ideas of connections, wide connections in the Neolithic between Orkney and southern Britain. There's some kind of intermediary links we have, such as pitch stone coming from Arran, which is only found at the Ness and at Barnhouse. And we do have a Langdale axe blank as well to kind of add into the mix. But there's also the Brodgar boy, this kind of little supposed anthropomorphic type figurine, but I think it's got something a bit more phallic in nature, which might add links into Ireland, some of the actual bigger stone phalluses they've found there. But I think that it's the ceramics, the grooved ware, which is undoubted connections, similarities, almost identical styles that we find in the grooved ware, some of the decoration. And as we get more into the vast assemblage that we have of the Ness, more and more those kind of links are coming out. But there's one piece of ceramic which perhaps even kind of epitomizes that even more. And it was a little kind of incense cup that was discovered inside or just outside structure 26. And that particular style of incense cup, there's only, I think, 4 other examples, which all come from the Stonehenge area. So I think things like that definitely kind of just, add credence to all of these long-term links. I think, like Alison, I'm slightly in two minds about the long-range transportation of animals, cattle, sheep, and things. But yeah, that's for another day. But I did like your slide, Josh, about structure 8 and the post parallels there. But I've always thought that the kind of post structure and parallels are perhaps more clearly seen in structure 10, where we have those kind of buttresses, corner buttresses, which are almost like, supports reflected in the kind of big four-poster structures, and again reflected more clearly in Mace Howe itself, where you have those corner buttresses which don't really kind of have any functional need for them, but they're there. And I think those are kind of definite kind of reflections of what's happening south.
Yeah.
So
that's true, and that links us through to those sort of square and circle timber structures as well, where the four-post arrangements are massively monumentalized. Yeah. I mean, there are also intriguing rectilinear post-built structures which have recently been recognised in the Boyne Valley as well, which again might provide a sort of sense of analogy and further connection.
Yeah, those kind of pierced structures we have at the Ness, for instance, 8, I've always looked upon them as kind of elongated versions of early Neolithic houses, or in the earlier phases at Skara Brae, where you have maybe not pairs of piers, but you have piers, you have recesses that kind of are defined by the piers and little end cells, etc. So it's almost just a massive, monumental Neolithic house, earlier Neolithic house.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. Really, really useful, interesting contribution. Now, one from Steve Marshall, who Josh knows well. So he is. So Steve has said Avebury is very connected to springs and river confluences. Is there evidence for this in Orkney?
Certainly good water connections, aren't
there? Much less so, because obviously Orkney is a much smaller landscape, and it's surrounded by water. I don't think there are as many springs. That you're not dealing with a chalk landscape, so the geology is completely different and the topography is different. So I would say the answer is probably no.
But the water connections are certainly there. I mean, it's something that Colin Richards wrote about quite a while ago, and certainly I suppose the sort of Ness of Brodgar Peninsula. I mean, the way it's kind of framed by the two locks again suggests that sense of being with water is a commonality.
Yes, I guess you're right there. Yes, yeah.
A question for Josh from Sarah Jane, who said, did you find much grooved ware during the recent West Kennet Palisade excavations? And if so, does it have any of the same similar unusual decoration as the links you mentioned with the material in Orkney?
We had grooved ware from 2019 when we were investigating parts of the main Palisade elements and some of the radial lines. Structure 5 is devoid of grooved ware. In fact, it's pretty much devoid of any finds other than thankfully lots of antler picks. So we don't have much of a kind of material assemblage to go with that. Certainly with the stuff from the main elements of the Palisade, it just kind of repeats features of the assemblage that were recovered by doing Alistair's excavations, which of course is similar to grooved ware from one or two contexts in Marlborough as well, sort of recent development-led work, which has taken place on the southern side of the Kennet, and of course within fairly close proximity to the Marlborough Mound.
And Jim Leary, of course, has suggested that the rather large ditch found not far from the mound, which is thought to be in the castle, could be something a little earlier.
Yeah. Yes.
Which I think is really interesting, because there's quite a scatter of some Neolithic and Bronze Age finds across that neck of the woods.
Yes.
So,
if we could just pick up Marlborough College and move it to one side.
It's very inconvenient, let alone the town itself, just in the wrong place. Yeah, I do like his suggestion. There's a henge hiding there somewhere.
Yes.
Malcolm has made an interesting, asked an interesting question, which is in the Neolithic period, if the climate was warmer, would that have meant that the sea conditions sort of up and down the eastern or western seaboards were much kinder, that the weather was better and more conducive to sailing?
I think that's a very, very good question. And that is something which Fraser Sturt in Southampton University would be much, much better placed than me to answer. I mean, certainly there was variability in the degree of storminess at different points in the past. So even though it might have been warmer, it could have been stormier at certain times. So I don't think we could say, for sure that it must have been easier. But I mean, interestingly, they were saying that if you want to cross the channel during the Neolithic, if you took a calm day, you could do it in 180 minutes, which is quite impressive.
Wow.
And we always tend to downplay prehistoric seafaring capabilities. I mean, surely all of this is just indicating that we're dealing with communities with very well developed maritime technologies.
Yes.
We shouldn't be surprised about the fact that they're able to sail from Orkney down to the southern coast.
And they would have learnt about currents pretty quickly.
Yeah, especially with Pentland Firth.
Actually, it's something I've not really asked before, but one for Josh, I guess, is that huge core, Phil Harding's favourite core. The assumption has to be, I guess, that it was brought by boat up the Thames. Do you think the Thames could well have been a route to get to the Avebury landscape?
Yeah, I mean, it's you still got to haul it overland for a good part of its journey. So if you're bringing it down from the Becklands, you've probably got to sort of move down the Chilterns or come down the River Lee or something like that. But I suppose a good part of the Thames would have been quite navigable, and also a good part of the Kennet would have been quite navigable. Presumably up until the area sort of Newbury, that kind of area. So, and perhaps even beyond. So, and we imagine that there's probably quite a lot of riverine travel and transport happening during this period, and it's probably sort of indicated. I mean, especially with the Thames, with the sheer quantity of Neolithic material that's been dredged out of the river, albeit a lot of it deliberately deposited, it still shows the kind of scale of activity along the Thames. It's kind of Neolithic motorway, really.
Yeah, indeed, that ritual deposits may indicate precisely that it was the major routeway.
Yeah.
Catherine has said, how would skin or log boats transport heavy rocks and flint cores? In other words, would the sort of boats you were talking about, Alison, what sort of weight could those carry?
This is something that actually Serge Cassen has investigated in Brittany, because he asked the question about how they moved absolutely massive bits of stone using boats. And he said, amazingly, if I'm not quite sure how it works, but he said if you put the stone under the boat or paired boats, it can actually float. There's some magic involved there somehow, but I could try and find his publication where he discusses the actual mechanism for doing that.
Well, I suppose there's a bit like the sort of 80,000 ton oil tankers still float because of the water displacement, which would sort of I can sort of see how that would work from my complete lack of knowledge. Yes.
And we shouldn't just rule out overland transport as well. I mean, this is another sort of possibility, as Mike Parker Pearson's argued for the Stonehenge bluestones, that you don't necessarily have to take them around the sort of dangerous waters of St David's Head. It is quite possible that those are being moved in timber frames and sledges overland.
Yeah. Well, those stones are only 3 or 4 tons, a piece of cake. Yeah. Okay. Rosie has said that she's interested in the shift that Josh mentioned from mixed to more herding-based economies in the Middle Neolithic. Could you do you think there's a link between that and community mobility, social linkages, long-distance contacts, and so on?
It looks like it. It was first sort of picked up by Chris Stevens and Doreen Fuller when they analysed the composition of plant assemblages from Neolithic and Bronze Age sites, and noticed that cereals are very, very well represented in the early Neolithic, and then they suddenly disappear. Certainly for regions of southern Britain, very quickly around 3,400. That's led to all sorts of suggestions. It might be quite short-lived but quite severe climatic events which are making cereal agriculture non-viable. And it coincides with also a kind of decline in big corporate monument construction. It then takes another sort of 2 centuries, 3 centuries before that sort of picks up again. It seemingly coincides as well with perhaps quite a demographic collapse. If you look at available radiocarbon dates, and if you look at early sort of Prehistory sites, which are less abundant than later ones. So there may be sort of quite marked demographic shifts, and with that, it looks as though you have a kind of realignment of networks. So this is a point in time where you start to see, for example, cremation coming in as a funerary practice, which is most likely coming from Ireland, from sort of Eastern Ireland. We have changes in terms of domestic architecture. There are old suggestions which, you know, might still be of some interest, that perhaps Peterborough ceramics have connections with regions like the Baltic, so going across the North Sea. And although that's upset Alison, but whatever the case, there are different networks that seem to come into being. I like the idea of connections across the North Sea.
There was one very interesting question somebody was asking about: is there any genetic connection between people in the north and the south? And the fact that most people were being cremated in the south means that there is just no DNA available from the south. Unfortunately, there is a small number of unburnt human remains from Orkney that date to our period of interest, but really without the corresponding DNA, you can't really say how similar they are. And the same with isotopic analysis, although it is now possible, as we know from Christy Willis's work at Stonehenge, that you can do isotopic analysis on cremated human bone to find out if the people were raised locally or not. But I think then the chances of being able to pinpoint somebody and say that person came from Orkney, very, very slim indeed. And the other question of interest to me is about this overlap between beaker users and the indigenous population. Yes, indeed, there was genuinely an overlap. But again, because the funerary practices used by indigenous people tend to be cremation, and they may well have scattered remains, the actual physical evidence for human remains is very, very biased towards beaker associated people, so-called beaker people. And we know genetically that they were incomers. And Stuart Needham has written a very interesting thing in this book called Is There a British Neolithic? Ta-da! About the relationship. He called them something like fascinating isotopic aliens.
Oh, it's worth pointing out as well that it seems to be quite peaceful coexistence as well between those communities. So they're living, I mean, they might not necessarily be living in exactly the same parts of the same landscape, but they are living within the same landscape. And again, something Mike's pointed out, that although we get evidence of, if you like, beaker on beaker violence, we don't seem to have evidence of, if you like, kind of, beaker people being killed with oblique arrowheads.
So don't believe everything you read in the newspapers about these marauder hordes of Dutch people who hacked down the poor Stonehenge builders. Think through.
The Daily Mail, isn't it?
Yeah, well, maybe I should be never believe what you read in the Daily Mail. I'd want to ask you both a killer question in a minute, but first of all, Dave Field has pointed out there's a dugout canoe of Bronze Age date in Derby Museum that had a cargo of stone in it, which is
fantastic.
Interesting. Where the stone comes from would be quite interesting to know. But killer question is what Alison said right at the start when you were still in your car, Josh, was she thought that the Ring of Brodgar had been inspired directly by Avebury, by the stone circle at Avebury. Discuss.
Why not? I mean, it's kind of interesting, isn't it, with Brodgar, because it's as you say, the evidence would suggest that it's coming quite late in the Neolithic sequence. It's unusual in that sense because most big stone circles, otherwise coming really quite early, coming at the end of the 4th millennium BC. So having a circle on that kind of scale constructed at that kind of time, and similar thing happening as Avebury, yeah, why not?
And I see it in terms of, it's almost as though these kind of luminous areas. So Boyne Valley was the must go to place around 3,200 to 3,000.
Yeah.
That was then eclipsed by Nessa Brogar in the area, heart of Neolithic Orkney. And then that was arguably perhaps eclipsed by Wessex.
Yeah.
Yeah, which certainly then certainly became an area to which people came from far and wide.
Yeah.
But I think what we have to do as archaeologists, and what you were doing in your talk, Josh, is kind of making a much more nuanced discussion about what was then happening elsewhere in Britain, and in the chronological bits where we don't know quite so much.
Yeah.
And also, was the Rudston monolith actually put up in Viking times? Ooh. Oh my God. But with that, it's almost time for tea.
Well, that is exactly what I was thinking. And Josh's glass, I'm sure, needs topping up.
Definitely.
So can I say a huge thank you to you both. Fantastic couple of talks and really interesting discussion, a really fitting way to celebrate the 35th anniversary of the inscription of the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site. And what do I say? Thank you for amazing talks. Thank you both.
It shows that everyone in Wiltshire needs to go and visit Orkney, doesn't it?
And vice versa.
Some of us already have. Thank you very much, and good night, everyone.
Night, night.